This is a Carnavalet museum in Paris, and this fine place is devoted essentially to the history of Paris and has all sorts of things on display, but the collection is dominated by a series of rooms more or less composed of decoration and in some cases actual furniture and collectibles acquired from Parisian hotels which were being demolished. And remember, that word hotel in French has a much broader meaning than it does in English. It's almost synonymous with secular urban building. This room comes from the Hotel d'Aubespine, which belonged to the family of Saint-Simon's mother. The rooms display styles of French decoration from the 17th century to the 19th, but we'll see just now some of the 18th century rooms so you can perhaps get a better sense of what the Rococo is all about. A few pictures worth quite a few words anyway. Light pastel colors, floral and curvilinear motifs, wooden plaster instead of stone and marble. On the whole, the look of the Rococo is a look that is feminine rather than masculine. In France, it's almost an entirely secular style, just as the paintings of Watteau and the other artists about whom we'll hear shortly are almost entirely secular themselves, and the music of Rameau is almost entirely secular. And while we do this, we'll hear some more of the Rococo music of Rameau, this time the contra dance from his opera Anacreon, performed at Fontainebleau in honor of the birth of the ill-fated Louis XVI in 1754. This is an original instrument recording. This display represents the Hotel de Broglie. The Hotel Brulard de Genlis. The Hotel Stoire d'Aubigny. This is a portrait of François-Marie Arouet, known by his pen name as Voltaire by Nicolas Largellière. Voltaire would have to be considered the most important writer in France in this age, although one could argue that Montesquieu and Rousseau are very close. We'll hear about Montesquieu in a bit, and about Rousseau when we get closer to the Revolution. We know almost nothing about Voltaire's mother, and he was always inclined to think he was illegitimate, so we may know nothing about his biological father either. But his legal father, an accountant, sent him to law school and then arranged for him to join the staff of the French ambassador to Holland, where he promptly got into a romantic mess that was thought to have endangered the dignity of the embassy, and he was sent home. His father threatened to send him to America, but he said he had renounced women forever and would go back to studying law. He was, however, soon distracted from this by the prospect of entertaining the socially important friends he had made, and quickly developed a reputation for wit that made him a welcome guest in the most fashionable houses. For example, when the regent said he was going to cut expenses by sending away half the horses in the royal stable, Voltaire quipped that that was very fine, but that still more money could be saved by sending away half the donkeys from the royal court. For this and similar jokes at the expense of the regent and the regent's family, he was exiled to Sully-sur-Loire in 1716, where he suffered really only by being away from Paris. And after apologizing, he was allowed to return, but the following year he was lodged rather than imprisoned in the Bastille for, among other things, implying that the regent was guilty of incest. I say lodged rather than imprisoned because he ate dinner with the commandant of the Bastille and was even allowed to use the bowling alley. Did you know the Bastille had a bowling alley? He was released in a few months, and in 1718, when he was 24, his play Oedipus, Oedipe, was a great success, and he was granted a pension by the forgiving regent, despite the fact that incest was an important part of the play. Remember, Voltaire did say that the regent was a better man than Louis XIV, despite his run-ins with him. Voltaire's career nearly ended, however, when he came down with smallpox while staying at the Chateau de Maison just outside Paris here. This was built by Francois Mansart, about whom we heard last quarter, for the first Marquis de Maison, and his grandson, the early 18th century owner, made Voltaire drink gallons of lemonade, alleging that this would cure him, and something did. He didn't die. His Henriade, about Henry IV, modeled on the Aeneid of Virgil, was in part written here and caused him to be acknowledged as France's greatest living poet. But this thing is long forgotten now and read by no one. It's odd that a man known for his wit and humor should write plays and poetry which are now thought to be pretty much without either. Only his novel Candide, which is essentially comic, if sometimes bitterly so, displays much of the sort of wit for which he was famous among his contemporaries. We'll hear about it next week. Maison is, incidentally, now a museum open to the public. In 1725, he challenged the Duke de Rohan, who insulted him, to a duel, which was illegal, and an order in the king's name assigned him again to the Bastille. But he said he would go to England instead, and this alternative, England being thought, I guess, a more or less equivalently unpleasant place, was accepted. He stayed for 4 years, met everyone of importance, and seems to have thoroughly enjoyed himself. He came back calling England a nation of philosophers. I believe it's Will Durant who says this shows he didn't stay there long enough. After his return, he started his long affair with the Marquise du Châtelet. Madame du Deffand describes her as a big woman with no chest, no hips, enormous feet, and bad teeth. But she was a real intellectual and had translated Newton's Principia Mathematica from Latin into French. And to Voltaire, that was about as sexy a thing as a woman could do.
In 1739, she bought the Hotel Lambert on the Ile Saint-Louis in Paris, and for a time they were involved in a sort of ménage à trois with the Marquis de Saint-Lambert, who was not related to the builder of the hotel.
Like the Chateau of Maison, this is another important building by an architect who was a subject last quarter, Louis Le Vau, the builder of Vaux-le-Vicomte and the original architect of Versailles. The Ile Saint-Louis still has several buildings by him standing. The Hotel Lambert has had many wealthy and famous owners over the centuries and has been redecorated many times in the past 300 years. It's not open to the public. By this time, the late 1740s, Voltaire had been admitted to the French Academy, been appointed royal historian by Louis XV, and written Merope, the play generally considered as most important. He was also rich, having, in addition to various pensions, the income from all kinds of investments. He was at the peak of his career, and King Frederick the Great of Prussia, who loved everything French, even while he was making war on France, was making him offers he could barely refuse. Here's another room in the Hotel Lambert. In 1749, the Marquise du Châtelet died after giving birth to a child, apparently by Saint-Lambert. Voltaire had long since resigned himself to her affair with the poet nobleman, but he was nevertheless chagrined to discover after her death that the picture of himself he had given her to put in a ring she wore had been replaced by one of Saint-Lambert. He renounced women forever, again, and left for Berlin, where there would be no women around Frederick's court, since he was the most notorious misogynist of his day. Voltaire never married, but he was constantly involved in relationships with women, many of questionable propriety. Well, we'll hear about his adventures in Germany next time. a portrait of Charles-Louis II, Baron de Montesquieu, Voltaire's slightly older contemporary, who beat him into the French Academy and then tried to keep him out. He was perhaps a more serious thinker than Voltaire, though not without a humorous side. His Persian letters, which gave him a Europe-wide reputation, purport to be correspondence written by a Persian visiting Paris and reporting back about life there. One of his most famous lines comes from this work. If triangles had a god, he'd have 3 sides. His Persian also says that a lord in Paris is a man who can see the king and who has ancestors and debts. These are both observations that have a Voltairean ring to them. Montesquieu was born here in the Chateau of La Brede near Bordeaux, and after traveling widely and dabbling in diplomacy and politics, he pretty much retired here to write his magnum opus, L'Esprit des Lois, The Spirit of the Law, published in 1748. Voltaire and Montesquieu are 2 of the first representatives of the Enlightenment, the intellectual movement that corresponded to a large extent with the Rococo age in the arts in the 18th century. And as such, to put it briefly, they emphasize the need for the rational explanation and analysis of things. Reason, says Montesquieu, not faith, is our most noble faculty, and he takes it for granted that divine right, so dear to monarchies, has no basis. His descendants still live here, but it is open to the public, during certain hours on certain days anyway. Montesquieu is most famous for his argument that there is most liberty in a nation governed by the principle of the separation of the legislative, executive, and judicial powers. Ironically, this argument is considered to have had a great influence on the American founding fathers, though he based it on his interpretation of the English government, which he very much admired. I'm willing to allow it did have a big influence, but I do think it's hard to recognize more than a very basic outline of our Constitution in Montesquieu's book, and a lot of his suggestions for good government were not, fortunately, I think, adopted. He identifies the executive branch with an hereditary monarch, and he thinks the legislative branch should be divided between a House of Lords and a House of Commons. The Senate of the United States really isn't very much like a House of Lords. Here's another view of the interior of La Brede. The weirdest part of the book is devoted to Montesquieu's theory of the influence of climate. Marx will think that money is the main thing that determines human action. Freud's going to say it's sex, and Montesquieu thinks it's weather. It's weather that makes the Italians lively and emotional, and that makes the English cold and unemotional. It's easy to make this look ridiculous, and it's probably this kind of thing that led Voltaire to say that it's sad that the book contains so many opinions, the contrary to which is almost certainly true. This is another view of the interior of La Brede, Montesquieu's home. He should perhaps be regarded as the first social scientist, but there's a good case to be made out that that term is an oxymoron, which I think has to diminish his achievement. Scientists can predict the future. Social scientists, and that category includes historians, can't. That's because the things with which science deals do obey laws, and the things with which historians deal don't. How many social scientists foresaw the collapse of the Soviet Union, even within a year or a few months of the event? Probably none. How many now claim to know why it happened? Probably thousands. How useful will their analyses be to us in determining when something like that might happen again? About as useful, I think, as the analysis by the sportscaster who said Cal lost to Stanford because the Bears didn't score enough points. This is a bust of Montesquieu in the Louvre. To me, Montesquieu is most interesting, like a lot of historians, when he is discussing individual events in the course of history, not when he's trying to discover laws and principles. The purpose of the past is to entertain the present, not to teach it, at least not in the superficial sense had in mind by those who say that if we are ignorant of the past, we will repeat it. We'll repeat it anyway. Charles Bonnet, a great scientist himself, compared Montesquieu to Newton. What a joke. less literary actors on the stage of Louis XV France was the king's friend, the Duc de Richelieu, seen here in a portrait. He was a grandnephew of the more famous Cardinal Richelieu. I say less literary, but he did write 9 volumes of memoirs, though parts of these, the juicier parts, are apparently spurious, at least to some extent. He was a participant in many of the interesting events of the day. He fought at the Battle of Fontenoy. He was a good friend of Voltaire. He helped promote Rameau's music and arranged performances of Rameau's operas for the king on occasion. And he introduced Madame du Barry, about whom we'll hear more in the future, to the king. Despite leading a life full of danger and licentious disorder, he made it to 92. Maybe in part because he was notoriously fastidious about grooming and cleanliness. The story goes that one day when the Count de Maurepas went in to see the king, the latter sniffed and asked him what cologne he was wearing. Maurepas snorted and said he didn't wear cologne, he'd just been standing next to the Duc de Richelieu. One of his Paris homes still stands at the right here, where the plaque is on the Ile Saint-Louis, around the corner from the Hotel Lambert, which we saw earlier. He also lived for a time at 21 Place de Vosges, in a building owned by his distant relative, the Cardinal, in which we saw last quarter. Another good story about him goes that when he was with the army at Fontenoy and couldn't take a bath every day as was his custom, one of his fellow officers made a joke about how he didn't seem to have his usual air of elegance about him. Richelieu promptly challenged the guy to a duel and killed him. This is the Chateau d'Anjony, which we saw back in the series on the Northern Renaissance. In Louis XV's day, it was occupied by Claude d'Anjony, and it is still owned by his descendants today, as it had been owned by his ancestors since the 15th century. Claude d'Anjony, like the Duc de Richelieu, spent much of his life either on the battlefield or the barroom floor and lived to 95. The moral of these lives seems to be fight, drink, and chase women. That is, live life like a real man if you want to make it to 90. Keep in mind, though, that Thomas à Kempis spent his whole life in a monastery and also made it to 90. As I was saying a while ago, it's hard to learn from history. Claude added the wing that has been the family residence at the chateau since the 18th century, and therein you can see a portrait of him on the right. On the left is a portrait of Louis's son, Louis XV's son, Louis the Dauphin, who did not live long enough to reign. Between his 2 wives, Thérèse Raphael de Bourbon and Marie-Joseph de Saxe, the latter was the mother of 3 French kings, Louis XVI, Louis XVIII, and Charles X, all of whom were to be overthrown. She was the granddaughter of Augustus the Strong, the famous Duke of Saxony, who was the father of Maurice de Saxe. This is the Chateau of Outrelaise. Another of the king's friends, Yves de la Boissière, invited him and the Dauphin to go hunting here, and the Dauphin accidentally shot Yves and killed him. To console the grieving family, Louis granted them immunity from taxation until the male line died out, which didn't happen until 1915. I'm a little skeptical, though, about how much the family really benefited from this largesse. That's the story, anyway. While we see more places owned by friends of the king, we're going to hear the most beautiful song from Pergolese's La Serva Padrona, A Serpina Pensierete, the point of which is to say, "You'll miss me when I'm gone." The servant mistress we heard about earlier sings this to her reluctant lover. In the quarrel over the relative merits of Rameau and Pergolese, Voltaire, Richelieu, as I said, and Madame de Pompadour did favor Rameau. The Queen and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and most of the philosophes actually favored Pergolese. The king, as far as I know, expressed no opinion. This is Dampierre, which was the home of the Duc de Ligne. It was a frequent resort of the Queen after Louis began spending more time with Pompadour. There's a bust of the Queen inside to commemorate her visits here. She lamented to the Duchess that after 1745, the only way she could communicate with the king was by writing him letters. This is Pontchartrain, west of Paris, the home of the Comte de Maurepas I mentioned earlier. After referring to Madame de Pompadour as a petite bourgeoise, he spent a temporary exile here. Arouet, near Nancy, was the home of Marc-Antoine de Beauvau-Crayon, the king's official shield-bearer, or écuyer. And inside you can see Louis' state sword on display in the center there. Beauvau-Crayon was also the tutor of Francois de Lorraine, who married Maria Theresa and became the emperor. This is now the library in the town, not the Palace of Versailles, but in the 18th century it was the headquarters of the Duc de Choiseul, Louis' foreign minister at the time of the 7 Years' War we'll hear about in the future. Choiseul had a way of getting the trust of powerful women like Pompadour and Maria Theresa, despite the fact that Horace Walpole says gallantry without delicacy was his constant pursuit. This is a portrait of him which hardly makes him look like a famous gallant. Walpole says his behavior was all the more reprehensible because he had a wife who was a woman in whom, as Walpole put it, industrious malice could not find a flaw. Choiseul did run into trouble with Dubarry, however, and was forced to resign when she became the king's mistress. Here's Francois Boucher's famous portrait of the king's most famous friend, Madame de Pompadour. As I mentioned earlier, they first met at the Utrecht ball at Versailles in 1745, and she was his companion, mistress, and advisor on all matters political, artistic, and social for the better part of 20 years, until her early death at the age of 43. Born Jean Poisson, and that means fish in French, she never knew her father, who fled the country to avoid prosecution for some crime, and her mother became the mistress of a fellow who arranged Jean's marriage to his nephew, the son of a court official. This made her known to important people, and when her husband seemed jealous of the attention she was beginning to attract, she famously remarked that only the king could make her unfaithful to him. This may have reassured him, but it shouldn't have. Menard here is one of the chateaux she acquired, and she probably got it for a good price because the Loire Valley was no longer the best neighborhood. Since Louis XIV's day, the king had spent little time here, and chateaux like Versailles and Fontainebleau, closer to Paris, were more in favor. It was remodeled for her by the greatest French architect of the day, Jacques-Ange Gabriel. It's now owned by something called the Société Industrielle, which rents it out for parties, weddings, and things like that. This is Champs, which has been owned by the state since 1935, and it was her favorite residence for several years in the 1750s, after she'd ceased to be the king's mistress in the narrow sense. It was built just east of Paris early in the 18th century by the architect Jean-Baptiste Boulay. It has a good example of a mansard roof, which is actually difficult to find on buildings built by Francois Mansart himself, after whom this kind of roof is said to be named. In the latter part of her short life, the Marquise de Pompadour was bothered by poor health and did become less the king's lover than his friend. Madame du Hausset, her maid here, like almost everyone in France in the 18th century, it seems sometimes, wrote memoirs, and as one might expect, they're full of subjects for gossip. Here's Madame de Pompadour's bedroom at Champs, and this is a sort of typical excerpt from the memoirs of Madame du Hausset. She says, "One day, Madame de Pompadour had me called to her room. When I entered, the king was pacing up and down seriously. 'It is necessary,' said Madame, 'that you go to spend a few days at Saint-Cloud, in a house to which I will have you taken. You will find there a young lady in a delicate condition.' The king said nothing, and I was mute with astonishment. 'You will be the mistress of the house, and preside, as the goddess in the myths, over her confinement. We have need of you so that all will come to pass according to the will of the king and in secret. You will attend the baptism and indicate the names of the mother and father.' The king laughed and said, 'The father is a very fine man.' Madame added, 'Loved by all the world and adored by those who know him.'" This is the work now of Francois Boucher, Madame de Pompadour's favorite painter and the favorite painter in France in the middle of the 18th century. This is called Armida and Rinaldo. It is the picture that Boucher submitted to satisfy the requirements for his admission to the French Academy, so it is his masterpiece in the narrower literal sense. Boucher was the most important member of the generation of 18th century painters to follow Watteau, and it's significant that his first paying job was to engrave a series of drawings by Watteau. Although I don't think any picture by Boucher would be mistaken for one by Watteau, they do share a basic attitude. Pleasure, not heroism or glory or the other usual masculine ideals, is the subject. This picture illustrates an episode in Tasso's poem Jerusalem Delivered, in which Rinaldo is on his way to rescue the Holy City with his fellow crusaders when he's waylaid by the charms of Armida. Two of the crusaders behind him seem to be saying, "What in the world is he doing? We're supposed to be fighting Saracens." This picture pretty much sums up the Rococo attitude in the arts as well as any painted in the age. Obviously, though, since the War of the Austrian Succession, about which we've heard, and the 7 Years' War, about which we'll hear in the future, were going on at the time Boucher was painting, it's necessary to avoid oversimplifying in our analysis of the whole character of life at this time. Just as one can make big mistakes trying to infer something about the character of an artist from his art, one can misjudge the character of an era from its art, too. The fact that no one painted a portrait of a smiling subject in the entire 15th century doesn't mean no one smiled. This is Diana After the Hunt by Boucher. He won the Prix de Rome, which had eluded Watteau. It's hard to imagine what Watteau's attitude would have been to the Sistine Chapel or Raphael's stanza. But Boucher was unimpressed. The godlike men and manlike women of Michelangelo revolted him, and it's not hard to see why. The pretty rather than the impressive is his goal as an artist. He painted 1,000 pictures, and almost every one is dominated by pretty girls. For every Mars, he painted 1,000 Venus. Pictures like this might lead one to suppose that Boucher was essentially just a painter of 18th century calendar girls, and there's certainly that side to his work, but almost as often as not, his women are depicted as powerful in an important sense, I think. In the picture of Armida and Rinaldo, it's clear enough that the power lies with Armida. Her femininity has stalled the whole crusade. In most of his pictures, in which men and women both appear, from his shepherds and shepherdesses right up to his gods and goddesses, the women are usually physically above the men, and even when they aren't, they are the primary focus of attention. This picture in Stockholm is sometimes picked out as his finest, the Triumph of Venus, or Galatea it's sometimes called. Here one might argue, anyway, that he's risen above the merely pretty to the beautiful. This is another room in the Carnavalet Museum in Paris, which we visited earlier. Boucher was not only a painter in the narrow sense, he supplied cartoons for the Gobelin Beauvais tapestry factories, designs for the porcelain factory at Sèvres, decorations of all sort for this chateau or that. He supervised at least the decor of this room, which was part of a gallery that sold engravings and other objets d'art. Although he was considered the most important artist in France before he met Madame de Pompadour, it was her support that made him Premier Peintre du Roi, head of the Academy and chief arbiter of French taste in the visual arts in the middle of the century. This, in fact, is a picture which he painted for Madame de Pompadour's chateau at Bellevue, La Toilette de Vénus, Venus getting dressed in the morning. I think one could claim that Boucher was at least as much a master with the brush as Watteau, as technically proficient as Watteau. A fellow who wrote a Smithsonian Magazine article on him, in fact, Dan Hofstadter, says, and I quote, "Very possibly he had more inborn talent than any painter who has ever lived." But prettiness only goes so far, even if it is virtuoso prettiness. Although Boucher is best known for his languid nudes, a large part of his oeuvre was devoted to what one might regard as equally fantasized treatments of ordinary life, as in The Shepherd's Idol in the New York Met. It's in pictures like this that I think the contrast between him and Watteau is most clear. Where Watteau produces poetry, so one could claim anyway, Boucher produces verse. One never gets the sense that in Boucher's world pleasure is transitory, or that his world is really our world at all. In Boucher land, pleasure is the whole story. Watteau's a more significant painter because he shows us something about our world, where pleasure is ephemeral and therefore in a way something maybe to be taken more seriously, not less. Carpe diem means nothing in Boucher's world because tomorrow's going to be just like today. His people, whether gods or peasants, live in a timeless daydream of sunshine, silk, and sensuality. Popular as he was, Boucher was not without his critics in his own time, of whom Denis Diderot, about whom we'll hear more later in the quarter, was both the harshest and most important. He was appalled by the sensuality of Boucher's women, but also by his unrealistically romantic treatment of peasant life, and landscape for that matter. Has anyone, Diderot asks, ever seen one tuft of grass that looks anything like what you find in his pictures? Here's Boucher's portrait, if we can call it that, of the Irish actress Louise O'Murphy, who was one of the king's later mistresses. Diderot thinks that art to be great has to be moral, but Diderot doesn't understand, apparently, that in the arts we just have to apply standards differently, if not use different standards altogether. This may not be an example of great art, but it's not the immorality of the subject that keeps it from being one. Well, here's Jean-Baptiste Simeon Chardin, who didn't like Boucher either. Think about this connection between immoral subjects and great art. Would Macbeth be a greater masterpiece if Macbeth didn't kill Duncan, for example? And we'll go on from there and hear more about all this next time.